11,000 years ago in the sun-scorched hills of southern Turkey, a group of people raised limestone pillars that should not have existed. We call their monument Göbekli Tepe, and it remains the oldest known temple complex on Earth. 4,500 years ago, on the banks of the Nile, a civilization we have never stopped marveling at built the Great Pyramids of Giza. Two monuments, 1,500 kilometers apart, separated by more than 7 millennia. For most of history, these two worlds seem to share nothing but stone and ambition. Then ancient DNA entered the picture. Scientists began extracting and sequencing genetic material from human remains buried across the ancient Near East and North Africa, and what they found threading quietly through those bones was something no one had anticipated: a connection, not mythological, not architectural, biological, traceable, real. The story it tells about who these people were and where they went turns out to be one of the most extraordinary in all of human history. To understand what DNA is telling us about the connection between Göbekli Tepe and ancient Egypt, you first need to hold both worlds in your mind at the same time and feel the full weight of the distance between them. Göbekli Tepe sits in the Şanlıurfa region of southeastern Turkey. Its oldest layers date back roughly 11,600 years. The people who built it had no writing, no metal tools, no pottery. By every conventional measure of what we call civilization, they were not supposed to be capable of what they built, and yet there it stands, massive. T-shaped limestone pillars, some nearly 6 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons, arranged in precise circular enclosures and carved with extraordinary skill. Foxes, vultures, scorpions, wild boar, rendered in stone with a confidence and artistry that still stops archaeologists in their tracks today. Ancient Egypt needs less introduction. The pyramids of Giza, built around 4,500 years ago, remain among the most recognized structures on Earth. The civilization that produced them was literate, agriculturally sophisticated, hierarchically organized, and capable of coordinating labor and resources on a scale that still impresses modern engineers. The conventional account of how Egypt got there runs roughly as follows. Farming spread westward and southward from its origins in the ancient Near East. Populations migrated carrying agricultural knowledge into the Levant and eventually into the Nile Valley. Over thousands of years, those communities grew in complexity, and from that complexity, pharaonic civilization eventually emerged. That account is not wrong, but it is incomplete because it treats the movement of agriculture as the movement of an idea, passed from group to group like a rumor, while the people themselves stayed largely in place. Ancient DNA has shown us that is not what happened. What moved was not just knowledge. What moved was people, specific genetically identifiable people, carrying their ancestry across landscapes and generations and centuries. And one of the most distinctive and traceable of those genetic populations, the group ancient DNA researchers identify as the Anatolian Neolithic. Farmer lineage was centered precisely on the region that produced Göbekli Tepe. That is the thread this story follows. Not a straight line, not a simple inheritance, but a traceable biological journey from a limestone hilltop in southern Turkey to the banks of the Nile. And what it reveals about the deep roots of human civilization is genuinely extraordinary. When ancient DNA researchers began extracting and sequencing genetic material from human remains across the ancient Near East, one of the first things that struck them was how distinct the populations were from one another. People living in close geographic proximity, separated by no great mountain range or impassable desert, turned out to carry significantly different genetic signatures. The Anatolian farmers, the Levantine populations to the south, the people of the Zagros mountains to the east, neighbors in the broadest sense, but carrying deep separate histories written into their DNA. The Anatolian Neolithic farmer lineage is the name researchers give to the genetic population anchored in what is now southern and central Turkey. Their ancestral signature is specific, enough to be identifiable thousands of years later in the DNA of populations far removed from their homeland. When you find it in an ancient skeleton, you know something meaningful about where that person's ancestors came from and when they moved. The connection to Göbekli Tepe is direct. The genetic evidence shows no hidden founders, no anomalous outside ancestry, coinciding with the rise of the site. The builders were the descendants of people who had lived in this region for thousands of years before the first pillar was ever raised. Their DNA carries no mystery influx, no signal of some outside civilization arriving to teach or direct, only a deep, unbroken local lineage, doing something remarkable entirely on its own terms. But who were these people in pragmatic terms? The archaeology answers that with striking clarity. They were not pure hunter-gatherers, neither were they fully agricultural in the way we would recognize. They occupied the extraordinary middle ground of one of the most consequential transition in human history. Tens of thousands of sickle blades found at the site point to serious repeated engagement with cereal crops. Grinding stones and mortars confirm grain processing at scale. Animal remains show early signs of wildlife management edging toward domestication. The structures themselves, some of which bear a strong resemblance to permanent dwellings, suggest people who intended to stay. This is a population in motion, not physically, not yet, but economically and socially. A community accumulating knowledge, refining techniques, developing the organizational capacity that would eventually carry both their genes and their accumulated understanding far beyond the hills of southern Turkey. Where they went next and what they carried with them is where this story begins to reach toward Egypt. The spread of farming across the ancient world was not a quiet, invisible process. It was carried by people real, communities moving across real landscapes over generations, slow enough that no individual would have recognized the scale of what was happening. Ancient DNA has allowed us to watch that movement in a way no previous science could, and what it shows is a population expanding outward from Anatolia in multiple directions, simultaneously leaving their genetic signature in the bones of the people who came after them. The westward movement is the better documented of the two. As farming spread into Europe over the millennia following Göbekli Tepe's construction, Anatolian farmers moved with it. They did not simply export an idea, they physically migrated, mixing with the Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations they encountered, and leaving a genetic legacy that persists in modern Europeans to this day. The scale of that contribution is substantial. A significant portion of the ancestry of people alive in Europe right now traces back to exactly this source. The builders of Göbekli Tepe are, in the most literal biological sense, among the ancestors of much of the Western world. But the movement was not only westward. Genetic evidence points to a southward and southwestern dispersal as well. Anatolian-related ancestry begins appearing in ancient remains from the Levant to the eastern Mediterranean coast, and eventually further south and west into North Africa. The route is not difficult to trace on a map. The Levantine Corridor, the arc of land connecting southern Turkey through modern Syria, Lebanon and Israel down to the Sinai Peninsula, functioned as a natural genetic highway. Populations moving along it did not need to make a single dramatic journey. They moved gradually, generation by generation, community by community, settling and mixing and moving again. The timeline matters here. This was not a sudden influx arriving on Egypt's doorstep. It was a slow accumulation of ancestry unfolding across thousands of years, well before the Pyramid Age. Well before the first pharaoh, well before anything we would recognize as Egyptian civilization. What arrived in the Nile Valley was not a conquering population, but a genetic contribution absorbed into existing communities over centuries, becoming part of the biological foundation upon which everything that followed was eventually built. The people who carried this ancestry southward were not aware they were writing history. They were simply moving as humans always have in search of land, water, and possibility. For most of history, ancient Egypt kept its genetic secrets as thoroughly as it kept everything else. The dry climate of the Nile Valley preserved bodies with extraordinary fidelity. The DNA degrades even in ideal conditions. And for decades, the prospect of recovering reliable genetic material from Egyptian mummies seemed remote. Then the science caught up. And when it did, what researchers found inside those ancient remains reframed the story of where Egyptian civilization came from in ways that are still being absorbed. The most significant study came in 2017, when researchers successfully sequenced ancient DNA from mummified remains recovered from Abusir El Malek, a site in Middle Egypt with a burial record spanning more than 1,000 years of ancient Egyptian history. The results were striking. Ancient Egyptians showed strong genetic affinity with Near Eastern and Anatolian-related populations, more so, and this detail matters, than with sub-Saharan African populations. The people buried at Abusir El Malek carried substantial ancestry from the same broad genetic world that had produced the Neolithic farmers of the ancient Near East. This was not entirely unexpected to geneticists who had been watching the southward movement of Anatolian-related ancestry through the Levantine Corridor. But seeing it confirmed in Egyptian remains gave the migration story a concrete destination. The genetic contribution was not superficial, it was foundational. Woven the ancestry of people who lived, worked and died in the Nile Valley thousands of years before the Pyramid Age. During the Neolithic period, when farming first took hold in Egypt and permanent settlements began to replace the older mobile ways of life. What this tells us is that the population of ancient Egypt was never genetically isolated. It was the product of mixing of movement. of multiple ancestry streams converging over millennia in one of the most geographically strategic locations on Earth. And among those streams, traceable and specific, was the Anatolian Neolithic farmer lineage. The same genetic population centered on the region of Göbekli Tepe. 2 points deserve emphasis here. First, this is not a claim about racial identity or cultural ownership. Civilization is not the property of any lineage. Second, an equally important genetic connection does not mean direct transmission of ideas or practices. What the DNA establishes is that the people who eventually built ancient Egypt shared meaningful biological ancestry with the people whose world had produced the first known temple complex on Earth. That is not a small thing. Genetics alone does not tell the whole story. It never does. What makes the connection between Göbekli Tepe and ancient Egypt genuinely compelling is that the biological thread runs alongside something else entirely. A set of symbolic and cultural parallels that once you begin looking for them are difficult to dismiss. Start with the animals. The carved surfaces of Göbekli Tepe's pillars are dominated by a specific cast of creatures: vultures, serpents, scorpions, wild boar, foxes, cranes. These are not decorative choices made at random. They carry symbolic weight pointing toward a mythology organized around the boundary between life and death, the wild and the human, the natural world and whatever lay beyond it. Now consider that vultures occupy a central place in early Egyptian religious iconography. The goddess Nekhbet, one of the oldest protective deities in the Egyptian pantheon, takes the form of a vulture. Serpents thread through Egyptian mythology with a persistence and complexity matched by almost no other culture in the ancient world. Scorpions appear among Egypt's earliest royal iconography, most famously in the name of one of the pre-dynastic rulers known as Scorpion I. These overlaps may be coincidental, but they exist across a cultural landscape that the DNA now tells us was biologically connected. Then there is the pillar tradition itself. The T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe, some of which bear carved arms and hands suggesting anthropomorphic figures, represent an abstract symbolic column with deep ritual significance. The later Egyptian Djed pillar, associated with stability and the backbone of Osiris, belongs to a broader ancient Near Eastern tradition of sacred vertical forms that carry meanings far beyond their physical shape. The specific forms are different. The underlying impulse to give abstract spiritual meaning permanent physical expression in stone runs through both worlds. Ancestor veneration and the ritual treatment of skulls, well documented at Göbekli Tepe and across the broader Neolithic Near East, echo forward into Egyptian mortuary traditions, in which the preservation and commemoration of the dead occupied the center of religious life for 3,000 years. None of this proves direct cultural transmission. Parallel development is always possible. Similar symbolic languages can emerge independently from similar human experiences of mortality, wildness, and the unknown. But the genetic evidence changes the calculation. When the people carrying these symbolic traditions were themselves moving southward across millennia, the possibility of transmission becomes something more than speculation. What the DNA has quietly dismantled is the idea that the great civilizations of the ancient world rose in isolation, that Egypt was Egypt and Anatolia was Anatolia, and the story of each belonged only to itself. The genetic evidence tells a different story, a messier, richer, more human story of populations in motion carrying their ancestry and their accumulated knowledge across landscapes and generations, mixing and settling and moving again, leaving traces in the bones of the people who came after them. The Anatolian Neolithic farmer lineage is not a footnote in this story. It is one of its central threads, a genetically identifiable population anchored in the region that produced Göbekli Tepe, whose descendants spread westward into Europe and southward toward the Nile, contributing meaningfully to the biological foundations of civilizations that would later astonish the world. That is not a claim about superiority or ownership. It is simply what the evidence shows. People moved, their genes traveled with them, and the civilizations that eventually emerged at the far end of those journeys carried something of their world inside them. This is also the quiet demolition of the lost civilization theory. Graham Hancock and others have argued that a sophisticated founding population now vanished, seeded the ancient world with knowledge and technique. The DNA makes that argument untenable. There is no ghost population in the genetic record, no anomalous ancestry, no hidden signal pointing to a mysterious outside source. What the evidence shows instead is a connected ancient world in which real, traceable, entirely human populations carried ideas and traditions across real distances over real time. The explanation was never supernatural. It was always migration. What ancient DNA has made possible for the first time is the ability to follow not just the movement of objects or architectural styles, but the movement of the people themselves. To trace a biological line from a specific community in a specific landscape to the populations that inherited their world thousands of years later. That is a genuinely new kind of historical knowledge. And what it shows about the relationship between Göbekli Tepe and ancient Egypt is that these two worlds were not strangers connected only by stone and ambition. In a real biological traceable sense, the people who raised those limestone pillars in southern Turkey and the people who eventually built along the Nile belong to the same long human story. They were across all that distance and all those years family. Return for a moment to those two monuments. Limestone pillars rising from a hilltop in southern Turkey, 11,600 years old. The Pyramids of Giza standing at the edge of the Sahara, built 4,500 years ago. The distance between them in time and space once seemed absolute. It no longer does. The DNA does not tell us that the people of Göbekli Tepe built Egypt. What it tells us is that their world, their genes, their symbolic traditions, their accumulated knowledge of how to organize communities around something sacred and shared traveled southward, generation by generation across the Levantine corridor and into the Nile Valley, becoming part of the biological and cultural foundation upon which one of history's greatest civilizations was eventually raised. Science did not shrink this story, it expanded it enormously. And the most extraordinary thing of all is that it was always from the very beginning entirely a human story. If this felt like a discovery worth making, like and subscribe. See you on the next one.